Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into a topic that might make you rethink some of your wardrobe choices, or at least the meaning behind them. We're going to be talking about the prophecies of Our Lady of Good Success, specifically her prophecies about modesty. And we're really going to be focusing on how these prophecies seem to have come true in modern times.
Yeah. It's really fascinating how these prophecies from centuries ago are so relevant today.
Right. We've got a lot of interesting sources to help us unpack all of this, like fashion history,
Yes.
teachings from the saints, some sociological studies, even some really surprising scientific findings. It's going to be a fascinating deep dive.
It really is remarkable how Our Lady of Good Success's warnings from so long ago line up with what we see today, especially over the past century or so. It's amazing.
Yeah. Okay, so let's set the stage a little bit. For anyone who may not know, Our Lady of Good Success appeared to Mother Mariana de Jesus Torres in Quito, Ecuador, back in the late 1500s and early 1600s.
Yes.
And during these apparitions, she gave a lot of prophecies about the future of the church and the world.
She did.
And one of her most striking prophecies was about a widespread loss of modesty, particularly among women and youth. She warned that this would happen in the 19th and 20th centuries.
Right.
Which is really interesting considering this was centuries after she lived.
A time far removed from her own.
And she didn't just say, oh, people are going to dress immodestly. You know, she was much more specific than that. She talked about the types of clothing that would be popular and the spiritual consequences of this whole trend.
Right. Exactly. She really went into detail about how these immoral fashions would become so common, how it would offend God, and how it would lead souls astray. Really powerful stuff.
Yeah. It's a sobering thought, you know.
Absolutely.
Especially for those of us who are devout Catholics and really take these prophecies seriously. I mean, it makes you think, how can we see these prophecies playing out in the world around us?
A great question.
And to really understand this, it seems like we need to go back in time a little bit and understand the whole trajectory. Like, where did we come from and how did we get here?
Yeah. A little journey through fashion history might be helpful.
Good.
So if we go way back, before the 1800s, modesty was totally the norm. People dressed to cover their bodies. And clothing really reflected that sense of decorum and respect that was so important back then.
Yeah. Like if you think about like Jane Austen or something.
Yes, exactly.
Everyone's all buttoned up in those novels.
All the way up to their chins.
But then we start to see things shifting a little bit as we move into the late 1800s and early 1900s.
Right.
Like corsets start to get a little tighter, necklines get a little lower, hemlines are rising. Just subtle changes, but definitely a shift happening.
Yeah, it was the beginning of a huge change. Like those first little cracks in the foundation before the whole thing starts to crumble. And you could definitely feel that change happening in the 20th century. It's like that rigid Victorian formality was finally starting to loosen up, and people were looking for more individual expression.
And then, bam, the 1920s hit. And it's like a fashion explosion. Hemlines are so high, the flapper dresses everywhere.
Yeah.
Showing more skin is all of a sudden considered modern and fashionable.
Yeah.
But this wasn't just an aesthetic shift, right? This was also about women claiming more freedom and pushing back against all these traditional expectations that had been placed on them for so long.
Absolutely. I mean, you can't forget, this was also the time of women getting the right to vote, the rise of jazz music, and this overall sense of excitement and change after World War I.
Yeah, it was a whole cultural shift.
Yeah, it was. And in a way, modesty started to be seen as something old-fashioned, something from the past that people wanted to leave behind.
So it was almost like women were saying, hey, we're not going to be defined by these old rules and expectations anymore.
Yeah. Exactly. They were breaking free and expressing themselves in new ways. And that trend just kept going as we moved through the decades.
Okay, so we have the 50s and 60s, and we see the bikini.
Oh, yeah.
The miniskirt. Styles that people wouldn't have even dreamed of just a generation earlier.
Right. Unthinkable. And then, of course, you have the sexual revolution in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
Which really pushed things even further when it came to revealing clothing.
But here's the thing. There's a difference between pushing for social equality and just embracing immodesty. Like, those are two different things, aren't they?
It's complicated, isn't it? I mean, the liberation movements in the 20th century were so important. They did a lot of good for women's rights.
Right.
But at the same time, modesty was sometimes portrayed as an enemy, like it was holding women back. And that created a really complicated situation.
Yeah. It's like in trying to reject all those restrictive norms from the past, we might have accidentally thrown out some really important values and virtues as well, like things that were meant to protect the dignity of the human person.
Precisely. And that brings us right to the heart of what Our Lady of Good Success was warning us about. The potential for harm, both to society and to our souls, when we abandon modesty.
Okay, so let's talk about those consequences. What did she actually say would happen as a result of this decline?
Well, she talked about how immodesty would offend God and lead people into sin. She said it would weaken families, lead to a decline in morals and respect, and ultimately it would contribute to a spiritual crisis within the church itself. She even warned that fewer people would be called to religious life.
Wow. When you look at what's happened in the church and the world over the past several decades, it's really chilling to hear those warnings.
Yeah.
I mean, she was right about a lot of things.
It's hard to deny. And you know what's even more striking? She connected the loss of modesty with an overall decline in reverence and respect in general, not just in the way we dress, but in our attitude, our behaviors, and even how we approach things that are sacred.
That's interesting. It's like everything has become so casual.
Right. Yeah, and it's like we're so focused on being comfortable and expressing ourselves however we want that we've kind of forgotten about the importance of formality, presenting ourselves with dignity and respect, especially when we're in the presence of God.
It's funny you should mention formality, because I've noticed that in my own life, I actually feel a lot more at peace when I make the effort to dress up a bit, especially when I go to Mass. It's like my clothes actually help me feel more reverent. Does that make sense?
It does. That's a great point. It really speaks to how powerful those outward signs can be, how they can actually influence what's going on inside us. And the saints have talked about this for a long time.
Yeah, they have. And their insights on modesty are so relevant to what we're talking about today. There's this one quote from St. John Chrysostom that always gets me. He says, "You carry your snare everywhere and spread your nets in all places. You allege that you never invited others to sin. You did not, indeed, by your words, but you have done so by your dress and your deportment."
Wow, that's powerful. That image of immodesty being like a trap, something that can tempt other people. It's a good reminder that our choices affect other people, even something as simple as what we wear.
Definitely. We have a responsibility to think about how our clothes might impact those around us. It's not just about what we like.
Right. It's bigger than us. And St. Padre Pio, who is known for being really strict about modesty, he said something similar. He said, "The church is the house of God. It is forbidden for men to enter with bared arms or wearing shorts. It is forbidden for women to enter wearing trousers without their heads covered, with short dresses, with low or sleeveless dresses."
I find it really interesting how he makes that connection between modest dress and reverence for the church. It's like he's saying that when we dress appropriately, we're showing respect for the holiness of that space. And it prepares our hearts for prayer, to really encounter God.
I think that's exactly right. And St. Alphonsus Liguori, he was very clear about the link between immodesty and sin. He said, "A person who deliberately dresses immodestly commits sin and leads others into sin."
Whoa, that's a really strong statement. It makes you think about the morality of what you're wearing. It's not just about personal preference anymore. It's about doing what's right. Choosing to dress in a way that honors God and respects everyone's dignity.
Absolutely. And then there's St. Jacinta Marto. She was one of the Fatima visionaries. And she was really concerned about the souls in hell because of immodesty. She said, "Fashions will much offend our Lord. People who serve God should not follow fashions. The church has no fashions. Our Lord is always the same."
It's so sad when you think about it, She really understood that modesty isn't about what's trendy or cool. It's about following God's will. Always.
Yeah, it's about eternity, not just what's in style right now. And there were even young saints who really promoted modesty, like St. Dominic Savio.
Oh, yeah, he's a great example.
He famously said death rather than sin, and he really encouraged his friends to stay pure and dress modestly.
He's such an inspiration, especially for young people today. It's so tough for them to resist all that pressure to fit in and be like everyone else. But he shows us that true strength comes from doing what's right, even when it's hard.
Definitely. And then we have St. Augustine. He had a lot of wisdom to share as well. He said, "In all your movements, let nothing be evident which would offend the eyes of another."
I like that. Like we saying we should always be mindful of how we're affecting others.
Yeah.
Not just thinking about ourselves, but being considerate and charitable in the way we present ourselves.
Exactly. It's about thinking outside ourselves. And of course, we can't forget about St. John Paul II. You know his amazing theology of the body. He talked about modesty being the guardian of chastity. He said modesty protects the intimate center of the person. It means refusing to unveil what should remain hidden.
His teachings are so insightful. He really understood that modesty is all about respecting human dignity, recognizing that we are so much more than just bodies. We're souls, made in God's image, and we deserve to be treated with reverence.
That's such a crucial point. And lastly, we have St. Francis de Sales. He was known for his gentle approach, and he gave us a really great definition of modesty. He said, modesty is the virtue that moderates all the internal and external movements and appearances of a person according to proper norms.
Oh, that's a good one. I like how he highlights that balance, that modesty is about expressing ourselves authentically, but still following those norms that uphold human dignity and help create that sense of respect and reverence. It's not about suppressing who we are, but about choosing to express ourselves in a way that honors God and lifts everyone up.
Absolutely. And when you look at what all these different saints have said about modesty, it's amazing how much they agree. Even though they lived in such different times and places, modesty is really about protecting purity, promoting respect, showing charity, and developing that sense of reverence for ourselves, others, and God.
I love that. It's so encouraging, all these centuries of wisdom, all pointing to the same truth. Modesty isn't just some outdated rule, it's a virtue that's crucial for living a holy life and a happy life. It's woven right into our Catholic faith.
It really is. And what's even more fascinating is that modern science is actually starting to back up this ancient wisdom. There's more and more research coming out that shows how what we wear and how formally we dress can affect our behavior, our thinking, even how we see ourselves.
Oh, tell me more about that. I've heard a little bit about those studies. What have they found?
Well, there's this one study called the Enclothed Cognition Study. And they found that when people wore formal clothes, like a lab coat, for example, they actually did better on cognitive tests. Their attention and focus improved.
Wait, so you're saying dressing up can actually make you smarter?
It seems like it. The researchers think that it might be because those formal clothes boost our self-respect and help us concentrate better. And another study found that formal clothes also seem to help people think more abstractly, seeing the big picture. Whereas casual clothes tend to make people think more narrowly and concretely.
That's wild. It makes you think about all the different areas where this could apply, like in school, at work, even in our spiritual lives. If what we wear actually affects how we think, maybe we should be a lot more intentional about our clothes.
Absolutely. And there's more. Studies have shown that revealing clothing, especially for women, can make them more likely to see themselves as objects. And that can have a really negative impact on their mental health, their self-esteem, and even their performance on different tasks.
That makes a lot of sense. If you're always worried about how you look to other people, it's hard to be present and really engage with what's going on around you.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that those same studies found that modest clothing actually had the opposite effect. It helped reduce self-consciousness and made people feel more comfortable and confident.
So there's scientific proof that being modest is actually good for us. It's not just some old-fashioned idea.
That's right. It seems like modesty is good for our minds, our emotions, even our spiritual well-being. And there's research on social behavior, too. Studies have shown that people tend to be more polite and respectful when they're dressed formally. So maybe those old-fashioned etiquette rules about dressing up actually had a good reason behind them.
This is so fascinating. It's amazing how it all comes together. The prophecies, what the saints have taught us, the scientific research, it's all saying the same thing. Modesty and formality aren't just random rules. They actually affect how we live, how we think, and how we relate to God and each other.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's like all these different pieces of wisdom coming from different places and different times, but they're all pointing to the same truth. How we present ourselves really matters. It matters for ourselves and for everyone around us.
So we've talked about the prophecies, we've talked about the saints, and even some science. But what about Mary? How does she fit into all of this? She's the perfect example of modesty and purity, right?
Oh, that's such an important point. And it's worth noting that in every single one of her approved apparitions, Mary is always dressed modestly. Always. Whether it's Our Lady of Lourdes, Fatima, Guadalupe, or Good Success, her clothes always reflect this deep sense of dignity and reverence.
It's true. I've always been drawn to how beautiful and simple her clothes are in those apparitions, but I never really connected it to this conversation about modesty.
Well, think about Our Lady of Lourdes, for instance. When she appeared to St. Bernadette, she was wearing this simple white gown with a blue sash and a veil covering her hair and her figure. It's just so pure and humble.
Yeah, it's so striking. And at Fatima, it was the same thing. She was completely covered in a white robe and a mantle. Her hands were clasped in prayer. It's such a powerful image of surrender and devotion.
And don't forget Our Lady of Guadalupe. Her image is iconic, and her clothing in that apparition is full of symbolism. It speaks to purity, motherhood, and humility.
It's like her clothes in those apparitions are a visual representation of the virtues she embodies.
Exactly, and that's a key point here. When we imitate Mary's modesty, it's not just about copying what she wore, it's about developing the same virtues that she had. Humility, purity, dignity, and charity.
So it's about making sure that the way we look on the outside matches what's going on in our hearts. We should let our clothes reflect the beauty and goodness we're trying to cultivate inside.
That's a great way to put it. And the church has always held up Mary as the ideal for Christian women. The Catechism even calls her the perfect exemplar of holiness, modesty, and virtue.
And Pope John Paul II talked all the time about how important it is to look to Mary as our role model, especially when it comes to her modesty and dignity.
He knew that her example could really inspire us and show us what it means to be a woman of faith, grace, and strength.
So when we embrace modesty, we're not just following some outdated rule, we're actually walking in Mary's footsteps.
Yeah.
We're trying to be more like her in everything we do.
That's a beautiful way to look at it. And it makes me think about another interesting trend that we haven't talked about yet. The fact that more and more priests, especially younger priests, are choosing to wear traditional attire again.
It's true. I've noticed that too. A lot of younger priests are wearing clerics or even cassocks way more often than some of the older priests. It's a really visible sign of their vocation and their commitment to the priesthood.
And I think it says a lot about how powerful outward signs can be, how they can reflect what's going on inside. I think it's worth exploring why this might be happening.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Why do you think we're seeing this shift?
Well, I think for a lot of younger priests, the clothes they wear are deeply symbolic. They see it as a way to publicly show their faith, how dedicated they are to their vocation, and that they're ready to serve. It's like they're saying, I'm a priest and I'm here for you.
It's a powerful reminder, especially in a world where the sacred isn't always respected or even acknowledged.
And I also think they see it as a way to share their faith with others, to evangelize. When you can immediately tell someone is a priest, they're more approachable. People feel like they can come up to them and ask questions or share what's going on in their lives.
It's like their clothes break down those barriers and invite people to connect.
Exactly. And I think younger priests also have a deeper understanding of what it means to act in persona Christi, in the person of Christ. Wearing those traditional clothes helps them embody that role more fully to really live out their priesthood in a way that's both visible and real.
It reminds us that their actions, their words, even how they look, aren't just about them. They're about reflecting Christ to the world.
Exactly. It's like their clothes become a sacramental and outward sign of the grace that's working within them.
And this reminds me of something both Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI talked about, how important outward forms are in shaping our inner lives. They're both really big supporters of priests wearing traditional clothes, weren't they?
They were. And I think it's because they understood that we're both body and soul, and that what we do with our bodies affects our souls and vice versa.
It's that mind-body connection again, right? It's not about obsessing over our appearance, but recognizing that how we look is connected to who we are on the inside.
That's it. And that the choices we make, even about things that seem superficial like clothes, can have a big impact on our spiritual well-being.
And this resurgence of priestly attire, it's not just about fashion. It's a sign that people are taking the priesthood more seriously and recognizing the importance of being a visible witness. It's a return to those outward signs that point to the sacred in a culture that often ignores or even rejects it.
It's a beautiful testament to the enduring power of faith, and it reminds us that it's important to live out our beliefs in a way that's both authentic and inspiring.
And this trend isn't just happening with priests. We're also seeing it with nuns. More and more orders that are experiencing growth are the ones that have kept or brought back the traditional habit.
That's so true. Orders like the Dominican Sisters of Mary, Mother of the Eucharist, and the Carmelite Sisters of the Most Sacred Heart of Los Angeles, who have either always worn the habit or have gone back to it, are seeing lots of new vocations. Meanwhile, lots of orders that abandon the habit are struggling.
It's really interesting to see that contrast. It makes you wonder what it is about the habit that appeals to these young women who are considering religious life.
Well, I think for a lot of them, the habit gives them a clear sense of who they are. It's a visible sign that they've dedicated their lives to God, and it's a powerful witness to everyone around them. It sets them apart in a good way and reminds them of who they are and what they're called to do.
It's like a physical reminder of their vows, a way to show their commitment to God and their community.
Exactly. And it's really different from what happened after Vatican II when a lot of orders chose to stop wearing the habit. They thought it would make them more modern and accessible to the world.
Yeah, there was this feeling that the habit was old-fashioned and a barrier, like something that needed to go in order for the church to move forward.
And unfortunately, that decision backfired a lot of the time. It actually led to fewer vocations, less visible witness, and even confusion about identity within religious communities. It's like when they tried to blend in with the world, they lost a part of what made them unique and special.
It makes you think that sometimes when we try too hard to be relevant, we actually lose sight of the things that make us truly distinctive and valuable.
That's such a good point. And it seems like people are starting to realize that, again, as more orders are rediscovering the value of the habit, both for themselves and the people they serve, they're realizing that sometimes standing out, being different, is actually what draws people's attention to God.
And we've had some very important people in the church speak about this as well. Both Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI said that the religious habit is spiritually and evangelically valuable because it's an outward sign of an inward commitment to God.
Yes, and Mother Teresa of Calcutta put it so beautifully when she said, "The habit is a sign, a visible sign of our consecration and our belonging to Christ. The habit reminds people immediately of God."
Her words are so simple, but so powerful. It reminds us that clothes can be so much more than just fabric. They can be a powerful symbol of who we are and what we believe in, a way to share our values with the world.
It really makes you think about how hard it must be for young people to be modest today. They're constantly being bombarded with messages that go against what the church teaches. It must be so difficult to deal with that.
It really is. Young people are facing so much pressure when it comes to modesty. Social media, their friends, the fashion industry, celebrities, it all creates this hypersexualized environment that can be almost impossible to resist.
It's like they're being told over and over again that their worth depends on how they look and how much skin they show.
And that's a dangerous message, especially for their souls.
It is. When young people start to believe those messages about modesty, it can make it really hard for them to develop virtues like purity, humility, and self-respect. They might start to see themselves as objects instead of as beloved children of God.
It's heartbreaking to think about the effect this is having on them. It feels like a spiritual crisis. What can we do to help them navigate these challenges?
That's the question that's on everyone's mind, isn't it? Parents, teachers, youth ministers, we're all wondering the same thing. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think the first thing is to create safe spaces where they can talk openly and honestly about these things, without feeling judged or ashamed.
I completely agree. It's about building trust and understanding so they feel like they can ask questions, wrestle with their doubts, and look for guidance without being condemned.
And it's not just about listening. It's about helping them understand the church's teachings in a way that relates to their lives. We need to help them see how modesty can actually make them happier, help them respect themselves more, and build healthy relationships in the future.
That's so important. We need to help them see that modesty isn't about taking away their freedom. It's about protecting their dignity and giving them the foundation for strong, fulfilling relationships.
And when we're talking about healthy relationships, we can't forget about Pope John Paul II's theology of the body. His teachings give us such a beautiful and profound understanding of love and sexuality, all based on God's plan for us.
Absolutely. He helps us to see that our bodies aren't just objects to be used, but that they're sacred. They're meant to be a reflection of God's love and beauty.
That's a message we really need to hear in a culture that often treats sex as something cheap and meaningless.
It is. And of course, we can't forget about the perfect example of Mary, the Blessed Virgin. She shows us what true purity, modesty, and dignity look like.
Her example is a reminder that modesty isn't about hiding ourselves away or being ashamed of our bodies. It's about embracing our worth as children of God and letting that shine through.
That's beautiful. And it means that we need to surround young people with good role models, friends, family, mentors who will support them in living virtuous lives. We need to build communities where modesty is valued and young people feel confident making choices that reflect their faith and their dignity.
And we also need to be aware of the messages they're getting from the media and society in general. We can't just ignore those influences. We need to give them the tools to critically evaluate those messages and figure out what's true, good and beautiful.
You're right. It's about helping them develop media literacy skills so they can recognize how our culture tries to shape our thoughts and beliefs about everything, from beauty standards to what it means to be happy.
So in a sense, it's about reclaiming the narrative. We need to offer a countercultural message that shows how beautiful and valuable modesty is, and challenge those harmful messages that are everywhere in our society.
Exactly. And it's not just about protecting young people, it's about creating a better and more just society for everyone.
As we've been talking, it really hits me how prophetic Our Lady of Good Success's warnings were. She saw all of this coming centuries ago. The decline of modesty, the rise of immodesty, the challenges facing young people, the spiritual consequences for all of us. It's a bit overwhelming, to be honest.
It's definitely sobering, but it's also a call to action.
You're right. We need to take these warnings seriously, look at our own lives, and figure out how to be beacons of light and hope in a world that seems to have lost its way.
And remember, we're not fighting this battle alone. We have God's grace, the Church's support, the wisdom of the saints, and Our Lady's loving guidance.
And speaking of Our Lady, you mentioned earlier that she's always modestly dressed in her apparitions. We've been talking a lot about clothes and how we look, but is there something deeper going on there?
Absolutely. There's a powerful message in the fact that Mary always appears modestly. It reminds us that true beauty isn't about showing off our bodies, but about letting our hearts shine through.
So it's like her clothes reflect what's going on inside. Her humility, her purity, her devotion to God.
Exactly. And that's something we can all strive for, no matter what we're wearing.
It's about making sure our clothes, our actions, our words, everything about us reflects the beauty and goodness of God that's inside of us.
I love that. And it brings up another fascinating point about this whole discussion, how powerful clothes can be as symbols. They can communicate so much more than just fashion or personal preference.
You know, it's funny you should say that because I was just thinking about this really interesting experiment I read about. Yeah, it was this experiment where they had people dress up in different uniforms and stand out in public, and they wanted to see, like, who people would approach and try to talk to.
Oh, right. I think I remember reading about that. It was really fascinating.
Yeah. And the results were pretty surprising.
What did they find?
Well, it turned out that people were most likely to approach the person who was dressed as a priest, especially if they were wearing a cassock.
That's so interesting. It makes you wonder what it was about that, the priestly clothes that made people want to talk to them.
It's true. It's not like the priest was, going up to people or anything. They were just
Right.
standing there. But there was something about how they were dressed that made them seem approachable.
Yeah, it's like what we were talking about earlier, that visibility and accessibility. When you see someone in a cassock, you know right away that they're a priest. It's a clear sign, they're set apart, and you can go to them if you need spiritual guidance or just someone to talk to.
It's like a visual symbol
Yes,
that lets people know they can approach them.
a visual beacon. I love that. And I think that can be really comforting in a world that can feel so chaotic and impersonal sometimes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like the cassock almost creates a space for those deeper conversations, those moments of connection that I think we all crave.
Absolutely,
Right.
especially in a society that can feel so disconnected and isolating.
It's not even just about the clothes themselves, right? It's more about what they represent, that connection to something bigger than ourselves.
Yes, exactly. It's like a reminder that we're not alone, that there's something transcendent out there.
Yeah, and in a culture that often tells us we're on our own, that we have to figure everything out by ourselves, that message is more important than ever.
I couldn't agree more. We need those reminders that we're not meant to go through life alone. There's a reason people in that study were drawn to the priest, to the person who symbolized a connection to something beyond just the everyday world.
It makes me really appreciate those younger priests who are choosing to wear the cassocks. They're doing more than just making a fashion statement.
Right.
They're really living out their vocation in a way that people can see and connect with.
They're reminding us that the sacred is still here, even in our secular world, and that there are people who are dedicated to bridging that gap between heaven and earth.
It's a beautiful thing. Well, as we wrap up this deep dive into Our Lady of Good Success's prophecies, I have to say, I'm feeling a mix of emotions.
Mm-hmm.
There's a sense of urgency because her warnings about modesty and the consequences of losing it are just so spot on. Like she really saw what was coming.
Mm-hmm.
But I also feel hopeful
Me too.
because we're reminded that even small choices, small acts of virtue, like choosing to be modest, can make a real difference.
Absolutely. It's been such a thought-provoking conversation. We've covered so much history, spirituality, even some science.
Right.
And I really hope our listeners are leaving with a deeper understanding of the power of modesty. You know, it's not just a rule, it's a whole way of life.
A way of being in the world that shows what we truly believe.
Exactly. And that even though the world can feel pretty crazy and confusing sometimes, we can be lights in the darkness.
We can live out those virtues that point us toward what's true, good, and beautiful.
You said it perfectly. We have God's grace, the wisdom of the saints, and Our Lady's love and prayers to guide us. So let's go out there with confidence and joy, embracing modesty and letting our light shine.
So well said. Thank you all so much for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, God bless you all.